Evento conclusivo della giornata, anche se c'è in corso anche la competizione di Startup Education, ma ormai siamo qui. Grazie davvero per la partecipazione, sono Damien Lanfrey, cofondatore di FEM e creatore di questo festival, quindi voi siete il ringraziamento migliore che noi potevamo ricevere, insomma la partecipazione. Io sono tra l'altro ho due background, informatico e sociologo. Da sociologo dico la partecipazione è l'unica risposta possibile e necessaria, cioè senza il pubblico vuol dire che stiamo sbagliando qualcosa, vuol dire che i significati che portiamo non funzionano. Invece, al contrario, viceversa, vuol dire che stiamo facendo qualcosa di giusto e quel qualcosa funziona per voi, questi contenuti funzionano per voi. Abbiamo visto molti di voi a tutti gli eventi oggi, probabilmente diverse persone hanno fatto, secondo me, anche una decina di eventi, posso immaginare, posso intuire, ecco qualcuno c'è. Io vi ringrazio a nome del festival, vi ringrazio a nome di tutti i partner del festival, vi ringrazio a nome di FEM, del Comune di Modena e di Fondazione di Modena, che sono i copromotori. Questa città si presta ai festival, è pedonale, lo rifaremo anche l'anno prossimo, quindi chiaramente il setting è sempre questo. Io vi ringrazio and I thank Bradley for being here. I mean, Alessandro will introduce you, lascio la palla al nostro Alessandro Zocchi, sempre di FEM, che vi introdurrà Bradley Busch. Non dico niente perché io non faccio introduzione della giornata, però grazie ancora per la partecipazione di oggi.
Okay, so I will speak in English, so I will make our speaker feel more comfortable. So good evening, everybody. My name is Alessandro Zocchi. I'm an educational neuroscientist collaborating with FEM, but tonight I have the pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Bradley Busch, who is a psychologist and director of Inner Drive. Inner Drive is a coaching company working in education, in business, and in sport as well. And they sort of specialized in developing in people metacognitive skills, growth mindset, stress management strategies, all with the aim, the final aim to guide the people to reach their professional and personal goals. He is one of the leading experts on how evidence-based research can help teachers and students as well to improve how they think, how they plan, how they work, how they study, and to take effective actions in order to become lifelong learners. He's also the author of a book whose title is actually, you will see, The Science of Learning. 99 studies that every teacher needs to know. And tonight he will talk and let us know some examples about what we actually need to know. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bradley Busch.
Let's get my slides up. Hopefully they come up. Hello. It's a good start. Welcome to my talk. Thank you so much for the introductions and for having me here today. So I always feel I should start by justifying what allows me to stand up here and talk about the science of learning. So in terms of my background, as mentioned, I initially started in sport, mainly in football. I wanted to see, could I help English Premier League players kick a football better by using psychological research? If you don't like football, don't worry, I promise that's not what this presentation is about. After a while, we got bored of that, worked with our Olympic and Paralympians. And when I was doing my work with Team GB at the Olympics, one of the questions we got asked is, how do we help develop better learners? Can we help our athletes learn more efficiently and more effectively than our rivals. And my job as the psychologist on the team was to look up what does the research actually say about the science of learning. And two things really stood out for me. The first one is all the research we use, none of it came from sports psychology. All of it came from educational psychology. And the second thing that I found very frustrating is I believe there is gold in the research. Like every question we could possibly want, someone somewhere has researched it. We might not have definitive answers, but someone somewhere has investigated it. And yet, this research is often very inaccessible. It's behind paywalls. It's written for other psychologists. It's often not written for teachers. And it doesn't filter down as effectively as it could. So to help this, my colleague and I, we spent 2 years of our life reading every research paper we could about learning. We summarized it in our book, The Science of Learning. Fairly recently, we've actually just released another one because my colleague told me no one likes reading anymore. People just want to look at pictures. So we released our Teaching and Learning Illuminated, which basically is our intent of taking complex research and making it look visually beautiful and understandable for everyone. And what I thought I'd do tonight is I thought I'd try and highlight some of my favorite studies and give you guys some space to decide how does this best apply to my practice. So without further ado, let's begin. To state the obvious, I think any conversation around the science of learning and how we can best help our students learn has to begin with working memory. And we all know that working memory is small, but just how small it is really fascinating. So let's take tonight's talk as an example. If I want to show you three studies you haven't seen before, the first place that information will go is in your working memory. But working memory gets overloaded very quickly. It's one of the reasons students tend to forget things at a much faster rate than they realize. And it can really hinder learning, this limitation. Now, as a psychologist doing these sort of talks, I don't get to do experiments in the research lab anymore. So I now basically just force experiments in my presentations. So I have a number of experiments for you to do tonight. The first one is my working memory experiment. If you have a pen and paper, or if you're taking notes, you're not allowed to do that during this experiment. You have to just hold the information in your mind. Do not help the person next to you. If anything, you are in competition now with the person next to you. I'm going to show you a clip. It's only going to last about 20 seconds or so. And at the end, I'm going to ask you some very simple questions about what you've seen. Is everyone ready? Your time and my first experiment starts now. Okay, let's see how we all get on. You're in competition with the person next to you. Even if you don't know them, introduce yourself to them. Let's start with a really easy question. Can you tell the person next to you how many items were there on that in that video? How many items on that conveyor belt? Okay. You get 1 mark and my respect. If you got the first answer right, which was 13, was the correct answer. Let's ramp up the difficulty a little bit. Were there any musical instruments? And if so, what were they? Can you tell the person next to you? The correct answer is, of course, yeah, it was the guitar and the violin. And for anyone who's feeling really confident now, let's end on a really tricky question. Can you tell the person next to you, what was the 6th item on the conveyor belt? Correct answer was the dartboard on that one. And this I find interesting because most people don't get 3 out of 3 In my experience, only about maybe 10 or 15% of people do. And yet you saw those items a minute ago. And yet within a minute, I can overload your working memory, and what you had seen has basically been forgotten. And yet on the flip side, we know that long-term memory is huge. Like, it's so big, we actually can't quantify the size of it. There is stuff locked away in the back of your long-term memory that you think you've forgotten, that if I ask you the right question, you will be able to remember it. So let's try this as my second experiment. Can you please answer these two questions here? That's meant to be me. That was before I had children and actually slept through the night. Can you tell the person next to you, what was your favorite TV program as a child? And what was the most popular song in your teenage years? What one song can you remember the most from your teenage years? I will give you 30 seconds. Can you tell the person next to you your answer to those two questions? And this, genuinely, is what I find so interesting. Like, that second question there, I haven't heard the song on the radio for years and years and years. I think I know every word, every lyric to the song Gangster's Paradise, because when I was 13, that was the most popular song. And I can remember that from 30 years ago. But yet the word experiment, that memory experiment that I just did, I can't remember some of the items from a minute ago. And now we start to see the difference in scale. And what does this really mean for teaching and learning? It means that transfer is key. Transfer from working memory to long-term memory. I can put anything tonight in your working memory by you just hearing my words. But what I really care about is, can I help you transfer it to your long-term memory? And that way you can build on these ideas, you can recall them later, you can think critically about them, you can be creative with that knowledge. And that only happens if we get it into your long-term memory. Now, unfortunately, this transfer doesn't always happen. It doesn't happen for a range of reasons. It doesn't happen when our students are really stressed. You know, it's really hard to retain and recall information when we're very emotional. It doesn't happen when we're really tired. It also doesn't happen if we have too much information at once. There's this kind of famous phrase that if you throw enough stuff, hopefully something will stick. That's the opposite of how memory works. If we bombard students with too much information, they end up remembering very little. And what often happens, we see this time and time again, students often overestimate how much they actually know. When they're doing their learning, when they're doing their studying, they tend to overestimate how much they know. To demonstrate this, I thought we'd do another experiment. So for this experiment, if you do have a pen and paper, this will really help you for this experiment. So if you have a pen and paper, please do take one out now. If you don't have one, turn to the person to your left or your right, very awkwardly ask them if they can lend you a pen and paper. Or if you still don't have, you can do this verbally, but it will definitely be better. Here's my experiment. The world's most famous logo that I think you have seen 1,000 times this year alone, and if I put it on the screen, you would recognize it immediately, is obviously the Apple logo. But I wonder, how well do you actually know the Apple logo? I will give you 30 seconds. Can you draw for me, without looking it up, what you think the Apple logo looks like? If you don't have a pen and paper, you can describe it to the person next to you. We have 30 seconds. What do you think the Apple logo actually looks like? You have 30 seconds. You have 10 seconds left. Okay. Now, give yourself, you have to be honest at this part, give yourself a score out of 10, 10 being perfect, spot on. This is what 10 out of 10 should look like. Now, make sure you get your score out of 10. That's very important at this stage. Can I get a show of hands in the room if you got at least 8 out of 10? So if you got 8 out of 10 or more, put your hand up really high. Okay, so this is interesting. Less than a third of the room got at least 8 out of 10. And yet, when I put that up there, we all know that's the Apple logo. Like, no one confuses that for the Nike or the Adidas logo. We recognize it, we're familiar with it, but yet under quite basic test conditions, the vast majority don't really know it. And this familiarity, this blind spot, this overconfidence can be a real barrier to learning. And fortunately, research has given us an indication of how do we overcome this? What are the best and most likely methods that students can do to ensure things like this get in their long-term memory? To answer this, we can look at this study here. If there is only one study you ever read around memory and learning, I would strongly recommend it be this one here. What the researchers of this study did is they looked at the most common and popular ways students tend to study. Then they went through hundreds of research papers to measure how effective are these strategies. I'm going to look at just 4. One of them is you get your students to read and reread and reread over and over again to try and ingrain that knowledge into their long-term memory. Second is doing little and often, as opposed to a lot all at once. Third is generating an answer from memory, sort of like a quiz, if you like. And then last but not least is highlighting key passages so that they'll stick in your brain for later. These were some of the strategies they looked at. And what was fascinating, the researchers found the most common, the most popular strategies that students tend to do themselves tend to be the ones that are the least effective. So rereading, as an example, I think we've all probably experienced, we've been reading for a long period of time and you've turned the pages and after a while you go, I've definitely turned the pages in the last 5 minutes, but actually can't tell you anything I've actually read. Like, it gives the illusion of learning because students go, look how many pages I've got through, but that's not the same as how much I've actually learned. Eventually the words end up looking like that. And then highlighting, really fascinating. Researchers haven't been able to figure this out, but there's a really weird quirk of the teenage brain especially. When you tell a teenager, highlight, what their brain actually hears is coloring in. And it looks nice, it looks pretty, it looks like learning's taken place. But most of the evidence suggests when you then close that book, people tend not to remember the highlighted passages more. The most popular strategies tend to be the least effective. Why is this the case? If there's only one thing you take from tonight's talk, I think it's this next slide here. The famous phrase that often gets used in cognitive psychology is that memory is the residue of thought. Or to put that in plainer terms, you have to think hard about stuff in order to remember it. So of course, rereading doesn't really help my memory because I can skim read. And likewise with highlighting, I can brainlessly and aimlessly highlight as I go along. It doesn't really force me to think deeply and critically about the content. And this suggests if we want to get things into students' long-term memory, we have to do strategies that make them do the hard thinking. And so if we go back to this study here, if we look at what we found to be the most effective strategies are the ones that you can't do without thinking hard. So doing little and often, as opposed to a lot all at once. And this idea of quizzing and retrieving information, evidence suggests these are our best bets for learning. So here's what I'd like to do for the remainder of this talk. I want to look at 3 main areas. One, I want to look at this term retrieval practice, which is this quizzing or generating an answer from memory. I'll look at the idea of spacing and interleaving, which is, revisiting material and comparing material. And last but not least, I thought I'd finish the talk on my favorite topic because I'm convinced this is the biggest myth when it comes to learning. We'll look at multitasking and how students are convinced they can do it and how all the evidence suggests that they probably can't. So let's talk about retrieval first. This is my favorite retrieval practice study. My wife thinks it's weird because most people don't have a favorite retrieval study, but this one is definitely mine, and I'll explain why for 2 reasons. Really clever study. What they did is they divided students into one of 3 groups. The first group they got to read the core text 4 times, and then they did their final exam. The second group, they got to read the core text 3 times. Their teacher then gave them a quiz, and then they did their final exam. Whereas the last group, they read the core text once. Their teacher then gave them 3 different types of quizzes, and then they did their final exam. And what makes this study interesting, just before their final exam, as they were about to do it, the researchers stopped them and asked them, how confident do you feel? How much do you feel like your studying has really helped you? And what they found, students love the rereading. Rereading is safe, it's comfortable, you never really have to confront what you do or don't know. And yet, when we compared their exam results, we see the exact reverse trend. And I think this is really interesting because what this suggests is 2 things. First, it suggests we need to think about how do we weave this into our practice? Where are the opportunities, either as a teacher within your lesson, to get students generating answers from memory, these sort of quizzes, and likewise as a parent, how can I encourage that at home? And secondly, that red bar graph on the left-hand side, because students don't do this stuff naturally, they tend to do the least effective strategies because they require the least effort. It means it's not enough just for us to do it ourselves. We actually have to explicitly teach students how to learn, because left to their own devices, they often make bad decisions. Now, why is this the case? And what is really perhaps controversial, what this study here suggests, actually, for many years, us in education, we've thought about quizzing the wrong way round. For years, we thought you do a lot of learning and then you do a quiz at the end to assess how much you've learned. What this sort of study suggests is the quiz doesn't just assess the learning, the quiz accelerates the learning. Being quizzed means you're more likely to remember that information. And why is that the case? Let's take tonight's talk as an example. Despite me believing I am doing a brilliant job presenting this in the most interesting and charismatic of ways, I know if you don't do anything with the information that we talk about tonight, within 24 hours, most of my talk will be forgotten. Because tomorrow, a whole bunch of other people are going to say really other interesting things as well, and it's just too much to hold in our working memory. And yet retrieval practice, evidence suggests, has 5 main benefits. The first one is it helps us make connections to stuff we already know. That's benefit number 1, it helps us make connections. The second benefit is it strengthens those connections. So it makes connections and it strengthens connections. Third benefit, evidence suggests students who learn using this quizzing, it tends to be robust under pressure. Evidence suggests they're more likely to be able to recall it in their final exam. So we've got make connections, strengthens connections, it's robust under pressure. The fourth benefit is it gets it into our long-term memory. And the fifth benefit is my favorite one, mainly just because the researchers have given it a funny name. In the research, this is called the Matthew effect. Now, the Matthew effect in the Bible describes how the rich get richer. The same is true for memory and learning. The more our students know, the easier it is to learn new information. And that's why some students learn at different rates. And this suggests that this retrieval practice, by helping them learn more and remember more, they're more able to assimilate the new information in the future. So they've got more connections to hook it onto. And if you still don't believe me as to the power of retrieval practice, let's do part 2 of my experiment, because I think the quiz doesn't just assess the learning, it accelerates the learning. So with that in mind, can you take your piece of paper again? You cannot look at your previous go. You have to do this from memory, because remember, the harder you think about stuff, the more likely you are to remember it. I will give you 30 seconds again. Think in as much detail as you can. Can you draw for me, for the final time today, what does the Apple logo look like? You have 30 seconds. Can you draw for me the Apple logo once again? And once you've done that, give yourself a mark out of 10 again. This is what 10 out of 10 should look like. Now, of course, the cynics and the skeptics will rightly point out this is a terrible experiment, because of course you're going to do better in round 2 than in round 1 because you only saw it 5 minutes ago. But more than having seen it 5 minutes ago, the fact that you've now retrieved it twice, I don't think in your life you will ever forget it's a leaf, not a stalk on the top, or that there's a bite on the right-hand side, not the left. And that's because you've had to think hard about it. You've been quizzed on it. Now, if we believe this quizzing helps people learn, the very next question should always be, when I give my students a question, when I quiz them, how long should I give them to have to come up with an answer, essentially? In the research, this is referred to as wait times. Sometimes it's referred to as thinking time. How long after I ask the question should I give students to think before I ask them for an answer? Research has never and will never be able to come up with a neat answer. It depends on too many factors. So there is no optimal amount of wait time. However, we do know 2 things from the research. We know the average wait time and we know the cost of rushing. So let's talk about the cost of rushing first. To demonstrate the importance of wait time and the cost of rushing, I thought we'd do another experiment. For this experiment, once again, you're in competition with the person next to you. This is going to sound very random, but will make more sense when you see the next slide. On the next slide, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of gloves. All the gloves have a pair, apart from one. So your job is to find the one glove that doesn't have a pair, essentially an odd one out, essentially. Now, when you find the glove that doesn't have a pair, please don't tell the person next to you. Let them struggle, let them suffer. Instead of going, it's that one, just to indicate to me that you've got the answer right, can you just fold your arms and smile really smugly once you've got the answer? But don't tell the person next to you. You have 60 seconds to find the one glove that doesn't have a pair. Your time and dramatic music starts now. So it's always quite hard to work out who solved that or who just naturally has a smug, smiling face, generally. The correct answer was, of course, it was this one here was the only one without a pair. And it's really interesting when you give people this experiment. I don't know if you all heard it in the first few seconds. There was an audible groan in the room. Some people thought, that looks so hard. I'm never going to be able to do that in 60 seconds. I'm out. I'm disengaging. I'm giving up. And that's often what happens to students if they learn that they don't have much time to think of an answer. They tend to just disengage. And this is really interesting because if we think retrieval is one of our best bets for learning, if I give everyone enough time to retrieve the answer, their brains essentially look something like this. Brilliant. Everyone has this retrieval benefit. However, if I rush, if I ask a question and go for an answer very quickly, it tends to look something a bit more like this, which is brilliant for the quickest and the smartest in the room. But for everyone else, the gap just gets wider and wider. Their learning is being short-circuited. So we know the cost of rushing. So then the question has to be, how long on average do people wait? And this is really fascinating for me. According to the research, the average time someone waits after we ask a question and get students to retrieve and actually ask them for an answer, on average, is about a second. To give that some context, that's about the same amount of time as a heartbeat. And if I'm saying retrieval is one of our best bets for learning, can anyone come up with this rich, deep, really considered brilliant answer in a second, or are they just giving me their first answer? Now, of course, there is no optimal amount of time. I did find one study that looked at 3 seconds as a threshold. And just so we're clear, I'm not saying 3.1 is good and 2.9 is bad. That was just an arbitrary cutoff they used in this one study. But what they did find is after 3 seconds, the quality and the quantity of answers improved and the numbers of I don't knows decreased. And in some situations, that even 3 seconds wouldn't be long enough. But I think it's definitely worth considering how long we wait if we are going to get students to do this sort of retrieval. So that's a little bit about retrieval practice. Let's move on to the next area. The other area that that study found that was really powerful was this idea of spacing or interleaving. So for the avoidance of doubt, spacing is the idea that if you do lots of little bits regularly, as opposed to everything all at once, it's better. Essentially, for students studying, far better to do 1 hour a day for 7 days than 7 hours in 1 day. The general rule of thumb with spacing is anything you gain quickly, you lose quickly. So, for example, if anyone's ever been on a crash diet, if you lose weight quickly, people then tend to gain the weight quickly. And something similar happens with knowledge. If they gain knowledge quickly by cramming it all in, that knowledge doesn't tend to last very long. And this is true in all walks of life. We know artists and musicians and actors rehearse for weeks in order to learn things. We know athletes train for years in order to ingrain it into their long-term memory. And why is this spacing so powerful? This is quite counterintuitive, but it turns out the act of forgetting or almost forgetting is a key part of learning. When students learn something and then almost forget it and relearn it, and then almost forget it again and relearn it, that actually helps cement that knowledge into their long-term memory. It's kind of like walking through a long field of grass. Every time you do it, that track becomes more ingrained and more cemented. Far better than what the research calls mass learning, or for you and I, cramming, essentially. So spacing is revisiting the same material again. Interleaving is a bit different, but they're similar. The opposite of interleaving in the research is called blocking. Blocking looks like this. I do one topic and I finish it, and then do a second topic and finish it, then third, and then fourth. The problem with blocking is by the time you get to number 4, you can pretty much guarantee students have all but forgotten number 1, and you have to start from scratch and redo it. Whereas interleaving looks a bit more like this. This is me taking it to an extreme example, just for illustrative purposes. But what interleaving allows is it allows you to go, how is 1 similar to 2? And how is 3 different to 4? And by having to do that, you're forcing students to think hard. And the harder you think, the more likely you are to remember it. Now, I've seen interleaving done in many different areas. I've seen it, the research typically focuses on maths, but I've seen it done in art. So there's a really famous study that had students compare the key features of art from the 17th century, the 18th century, and the 19th century. And by interleaving, by having them side by side, as opposed to just doing one, then another, they were more able to distinguish the differences. We've seen this done a lot in PE as well. So you can do it on a range of subjects. And here for me is why this interleaving, this comparing one versus the other, is so powerful. I thought I'd highlight this study here. In this study, they compared students who did blocking, do topic 1, topic 2, and then topic 3, with students who did this interleaving of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And what made this study really clever is they then measured how much did they learn and remember at the end of the day, and then also a week later, which is like a proxy for long-term memory. Here's what they found. On the day, blocking is far better. So if you just do one thing, at the end of that day, students tend to repeat it back to you, and it gives this perception that it's been learned. But when we fast forward a week later, what did we find? Those who did this interleaving, they didn't get much of a gain, but what they had learned had stuck. We can say it was quite sticky learning. Whereas those who did the blocking, just 1 week later, get this huge degradation in learning and performance. And I look at graphs like that, and I go, if that's the difference in a week, what's the difference going to be like, you know, in a month, in a term, over the course of a whole year? And that's why I generally believe any school that isn't consciously thinking about spacing, how do we revisit material, and this interleaving, how do I help students compare and contrast between A versus B, is missing a real big learning and performance gain. Essentially, if I was going to draw the graph, this for me is what you want to avoid. Anything you gain quickly, you lose quickly. So students like this initially, so it gives this false confidence. On the day, if I test you, you're going to score well, but you tend not to remember it long term. Whereas this interleaving and spacing, for me, looks like this is what we're aiming for. Yes, it's more painful and slower initially because students struggle. It takes you longer because you have to go back and revisit material. But because you've nailed the fundamentals, because more stuff is cemented in long-term memory, more stuff tends to stick. This, for me, provides sort of the justification for this spacing and interleaving. So those are my two best bets. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to go on to my third and final section, which is about multitasking. This, for me, the first two, retrieval and spacing, are things we, as either parents or educators, can weave into our instruction, can use in the classroom to help improve learning. This last one, multitasking, is on students. Yes, we have to educate them, but here are some of the mistakes I see students typically making. Most students falsely believe they can multitask. And I want to demonstrate how I believe multitasking, conscious multitasking, is a complete myth. And you won't be surprised to hear I have some experiments to demonstrate this. So this is a two-part experiment. This is a typical test that psychologists do. It's called a concentration grid. So on the next slide, you have 30 seconds. You're going to see a box that has all the numbers from 1 to 100. Your job is to find number 1. And once you've found number 1, can you then find number 2? And once you find number 2, can you find number 3? And the aim is to see how high can you get in 30 seconds, okay? And I want you to see, can you beat the person next to you, okay? So round 1, classic concentration grid. You have 30 seconds. Your time starts now. Okay, tell the person next to you, how well did you do? What number did you get up to on the concentration grid? Okay, let's do round 2. Now, remember I told you, you can't multitask. I'm going to throw a number of distractions at you during this experiment, during round 2. I want you to ignore them all. You won't be able to because people can't multitask. And I've even told you that, but let's see how everyone gets on. So in round 2, I want you to pick up wherever you left off. So if you got to number 8 last time, you're now looking for number 9, essentially. So pick up where you get left off. Ignore all the distractions. Best of luck. Your 30 seconds starts now. Tell the person next to you, what number did you get up to? So, like, it's impossible to really stay on task. It takes a lot of concentration, a lot of effort. It's probably quite stressful to even try and do so. Let me explain it to you in another way. This is a very famous psychological test we sometimes give people. Can you tell the person next to you what you see in this picture here? You have 5 seconds to look at it. Tell the person next to you, what do you see in this photo here? Okay, let's try this. Can you put your hand high in the air if you can see the man looking dead straight at the back of the room? Can you put your hand in the air if you can see the man looking straight at the back of the room? Put your hand in the air if you can see the man looking sideways. Stick your hand in there if you can see him looking in both directions. Okay, so the fact that most of you can see he's looking in both directions, that's good. What's fascinating about this experiment is you can't really see both at the exact same time. Let me show you what I mean. On this, can you make him look dead straight at the back of the room in your mind? Can everyone make him look dead straight? Now switch to make him look sideways. Can everyone do that switch? Now switch back to make him look at the back of the room. Most of the time, when people think they're multitasking, what they're actually doing is task switching. But that switching takes time and effort and energy, so you can't make them look in both directions at the exact same time. And yet students have grown up, I think, this generation, because they're the first generation really to grow up with iPads and iPhones as the norm from birth, believing they can multitask. And I see this all the time, especially on mobile phones, this belief that I can do my homework or study whilst watching TikTok. I can have Netflix on in the background while also doing my work. And this is why mobile phones are a real challenge for learning, because they're so distracting. And not only are they distracting, people often don't realize just how distracting they are. And one of the key ways that I see students try to multitask, I get asked this question in pretty much every school that I go to from students. Because when people multitask, essentially that switching, because it takes time and effort and energy, it doesn't really work. The biggest question that I often get asked by students is, can I revise whilst listening to music? And a number of students are convinced, actually, not only that they can, that it's better for them. So this is the last study I want to talk you through. So I think this is about a definitive answer as we've got. Here's what this study looked at. They got students in one of 4 conditions. The first group got to revise and do their homework and prepare for a test in silence. The second group, they got to do their studying whilst listening to music that had lyrics that the students liked. So essentially the students could come with their own playlist. The brilliant thing about psychological research is at the back of the studies, they have to include all the materials that were used in the study. And so I was really keen to know, in the summer of 2014, what was the most popular song that students were choosing to study to? It sounds something like this. As a huge One Direction fan, I was delighted to see that actually published in a psychological article. The third group, they got to revise to music that had lyrics that they didn't like. So previously, the researchers had found a song that polled pretty badly. So now we want to see, does it matter if you like the music or not? This sounded quite different to One Direction. The song they came up with was from the heavy thrash metal band Angels of Death. And it sounds something like this. And then the last group got to revise music that didn't have lyrics, so instrumental music. Now, when I read this study, I assumed they were going to go for Mozart or Beethoven. There's some lovely classical instrumental music. The researchers didn't, because they said that's the music us adults want students to listen to. They wanted to go for music that students self-select, essentially, that didn't have lyrics. It sounded something like this. If you think that didn't sound like music, that just sounded like noise, you're officially middle-aged, is essentially the answer there. If I was to give you 20 seconds to predict, what did the researchers find? What would be your gut feeling? Can you just tell the person next to you, what's your gut feeling? What do you think they found within these 4 conditions led to the best or worst type of learning? I'll give you 20 seconds to tell the person next to you, what's your gut feeling? Here are the results. And there's 2 main things that stand out to me. Here's what the researchers found. The results look something like this. The first one, silence is golden. It might not be the most popular answer for students. They don't like hearing this. But essentially, if music is on, the music gets in their head. and I don't want the music to get in their head. I want the revision and the learning to get in their head. You know, this is probably true if you've ever been driving with someone. If you know where you're going, you can have the music on, you can have your child in the back seat talking to you. But as soon as you're lost, what's the first thing everyone does when they're lost? Is they tell their partner or their child to be quiet for 2 minutes. They turn the music off because they go, I just need to think. We know when you consciously need to think, when it's not automatic, music tends to impede that learning. The other thing I find really interesting is the bottom two findings, those two in the bottom right. It doesn't matter if they like the music or not. If it has lyrics, that lyrics forces them to essentially task switch. And we know that's not possible. And this, for me, is a great example of people confusing what they like and what they prefer with what's best for them. But, you know, I always kind of say, my 5-year-old, he likes chocolate chip cookies for breakfast. That's what he likes and that's what he prefers. But I know that's not what's best for him. And the same, I think, often happens with students with learning, is because we don't do this stuff naturally, we actually have to teach people about this stuff if they're to get the benefit of it. So that is my whistle-stop tour of the 3 areas I wanted to cover: retrieval practice, generating an answer from memory, spacing and interleaving, this revisiting and comparing and contrasting, and last but not least, this sort of multitasking myth. Now, if this sort of stuff has piqued your interest, these kind of screenshots, this is actually taken from our book. We told our publisher we'd only do our book, The Science of Learning, if we could give a lot of it away for free. So if you want to read some of the details around some of the studies, some of which I've mentioned today, if you Google the phrase inner drive studies, you'll find about 30 of my favorite studies that we've summarized online, available to download completely for free. Each of them is linked to the original study in case you want to go into a bit more depth and detail. But that's our way of trying to get good research out there in the world. The other thing I thought I should probably mention before I take some questions, I think we've got time for that. One of the ways we try and spread this message of research and cognitive science is we have a platform called our Teacher CPD Academy. It's for schools that want to be able to access this stuff. There's lots of different modules around different topics, around memory and learning and feedback. One of my favorite features of it, actually, I've spent the last year, and I've been very lucky to do this, interviewing researchers, so therefore they can describe the findings in their own words and they can share it with staff. If you are part of a school, if you are a classroom teacher, especially if you're involved in the training of your colleagues, if you take your phones out now, if you... Oh, I think my microphone... No, it's all right. If you scan that QR code, you can have 2 weeks free access for all festival goers. That can give you an insight into some of the research and how we try and help schools. If you have any questions, we'll do our best to answer all of them. Yeah, thank you very much. If anyone wants to ask any questions, I'll be around for this. Also, feel free to email me. I could honestly talk about this stuff all day, every day. If there's any studies you want us to send that I've mentioned today, I'll do my best to get those over to you. Thank you very much for coming to listen to me talk. I hope it's been okay. Thank you very much. Thanks. I'll probably put this. I need to put this in.
So thank you very much, Bradley, for this fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, and let me just change the mic so I can go and... Give me my mic.
I can hear you.
Okay, any question?
Yes, hi, thank you very much.
Thank you.
My question is, how much of this apply to people with learning disabilities?
That is a brilliant question. Sorry, can I check? Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? That is a brilliant question. What's fascinating is, so my wife is a child psychologist who does a lot of diagnosis. So we talk about that question pretty much every night around the dinner table. There isn't as much research as I would like, but the research we have is really encouraging. My gut feeling, in fact, I'm more than that, I'm pretty sure the same principles apply, but they probably need to be adapted. So the principles of we need to revisit material because you might forget it, or working memory is limited, those principles I think are constant for all people. what that looks like in terms of the application might be slightly different. So for example, typically I imagine you have to break it down into smaller chunks, depending on the learning difficulty. The rate that you revisit material might be increased, but it's the same principles. And if anything, I think when you work with students with learning difficulties, that's often where you see really good practice on this sort of stuff. So it might look different in the strategy, but the principle, I think, is absolutely constant throughout. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Any more questions? Raise your hands, please. Here we go. Oh, there.
Hi, thanks a lot for your really fruitful introduction and presentation. What about spaced learning, introducing pauses and breaks into learning?
Yeah, so the biggest challenge, I think, for researchers is to work out how long should the gap be before we revisit material. There are some rough guidelines, but nothing that's concrete enough. The rough rule of thumb is, generally speaking, you want to revisit material just before your students have forgotten it. And so therefore, the only way to find that out often is to ask them lots of questions, which is why it often goes hand in hand with that retrieval. Because retrieval allows me to embed the information, but it also allows me to check if you've forgotten it from a couple of weeks ago. And that's why this stuff, research will never give us a definitive answer. It's always going to be a judgment call. And I think research should inform that judgment, but it shouldn't replace it. So we don't know how long the gap should be. We just know it's important that it is revisited, ideally just before they've forgotten it. Thanks. There's a question there.
Any more?
Hi. Hello. Thank you. Hi. So I see a rush among all teachers and school heads. Like they are trying to get as many as new devices, like new PC, new television, and everything in 3D, so you can do the best, the better. And I think I always say my students, you have to do it the hard way. So, and I think, do you think this is a good way to improve our learning, or it is, or whatever you?
So it's a minefield, is the honest answer. I'll start with the good stuff first. There are definitely some advantages and learning gains to be had by technology, like being able to access information, a better way of saving it and sharing that information and interacting with them are clearly some gains. However, we have to acknowledge there are some significant learning losses that occur when you make things too easy. So to give you one example, a really famous study compared getting students to handwrite their notes during the lesson versus typing it on a laptop or an iPad. And what they found, students who did it handwritten remembered significantly more than those who did it electronically, for the simple reason that when you do stuff electronically, most people can type faster than what they can write. And because you can type faster, what typically happens is they just write down everything that I've said. So they just write it down word for word. And we say that's quite a shallow processing. Whereas because you write slower, you can't write everything down. You're forced to have to think, what's the key information? How can I summarize that? It actually prompts me to think harder because I have to make some choices along the way. So for me, note-taking, I'd always go at the moment, pen and paper over electronic. That's not to say you can't get some other good stuff from electronic. I think you have to weigh up the cost, both financially and also in time in training. The research that I've seen, if you are going to go down a digital route, suggests it works better when the school can control for distractions. So just giving students a laptop or an iPad, if that stuff you can access Twitter, TikTok, games, then all the concentration in the world isn't going to be able to overcome those distractions. So I think you need really good guidelines, lots of training, and using it selectively. I think technology should solve a problem, whereas what I see sometimes in the UK, for example, is they have the technology and we go, how can we make sure we use it, as opposed to what problem is it addressing? So I think it can be good, but we do want to make sure that students are interacting with the material and thinking hard about it. Hope that helps. Cheers.
Any more questions?
I'll just put this on just in case.
I have two questions. The
Sure.
first one is about using music to study theoretical things, like, I don't know, studying history.
Yeah.
Or doing more practical things like math or translating things.
Yeah.
This is because of my personal experience. I used music just to focus my attention on what I was doing.
Okay.
And not going away with the thought.
Yeah. So,
The second,
no, let me do that one first, and I'll come to you for the second question.
Okay.
So that's a really good question. Research is clear. Music can help in certain situations. So music can help motivation. So when I go to the gym, and I hate the gym, music helps me block out the pain of the treadmill, basically. So we know it helps there. Evidence suggests music can also help mood and creativity. But generally speaking, when you're having to learn complex or new information, music tends to hinder. If you're already at a high level of automaticity and you're just reinforcing previously learned stuff, then it might be a bit better. There is some research for certain profile of students. So we know, for example, students with ADHD, there's some nice evidence to suggest music or white noise actually helps them focus. So it's not a slam dunk, but generally speaking, if I had 100 students, if I was talking on average, music that have lyrics, I'd be pretty confident will hinder. But for some individual profiles in some situations, I could see how it could be of benefit. Hope that helps.
okay, the second question
Yeah.
is, what about peer-to-peer?
Yeah.
So when you explain something to someone else,
Yeah.
is it
Yeah. So
cementing the
Yeah.
knowledge?
So yes and no. Let's start with the good stuff of peer-to-peer first. If you want to Google this area, a great phrase to Google is called the protege effect. So the protege effect in psychology describes how if I teach you something, not only do you get the learning gain, but I actually get a learning gain because I've had to think hard. I've had to organize my thoughts. I've probably had to predict what questions you might ask me. So it makes me have to learn it even better. So there are some good benefits from peer-to-peer. The downside and the risk is it's very easy for misconceptions to spread. If I don't have a very clear understanding myself and I teach it to you, it cements the wrong thing for me and it cements the wrong information for you. Generally speaking, the evidence I've seen is that peer-to-peer process, that protege effect, works best towards the end of the learning process. Once you're pretty confident that they do generally know the information, I wouldn't do it too early, because if I was going to teach you something that I'm not sure about, I think misunderstandings can quickly spread, and that's the risk of doing that. So it can work in the right settings. Really nice question, though.
Any more? Actually, I have one.
Okay,
We noticed that teachers,
Yeah.
once they know what the best study strategies are,
Yeah.
they actually struggle to make their students change
Yeah.
their habits. Would you have any suggestion or advice for them?
So getting students to do this stuff themselves is a really big battle. The best example, the analogy I can come up with is, so about 20 years ago in England, we did a lot of education around smoking behaviors, as a side note here. And we did a lot of education. People tended to reduce their smoking rates, but a number still persisted. The biggest change in England in the last 20 years was when we changed the environment, when it was banned in restaurants and pubs. And that's why it's a good example for like retrieval, is just telling students the benefits of it isn't enough to change behavior. Like, it's not just enough to know stuff. It's how do I make it routine and make it habit? And there's some nice studies that actually just come out in the last few months that look at, there's a few step-by-steps you can do. The first step is to tell them the benefits. The second step is to get them to experience it themselves. And the best way to do that is to make sure they do it in your lesson. So you have to be clear, this is why we're doing it. These are the examples of how we can do retrieval. We could do multiple choice. We could do flashcards. We could do past papers. but actually getting them to experience it in your lesson and doing that repeatedly is often a precursor for them doing it by themselves. But just giving one session like this talk here, if I gave that to students, I wouldn't expect that by itself to change behavior, because we are often creatures of habit. So it's knowing how to do it, why to do it, and crucially getting them to experience the benefit of it. And only then, I think, are they likely to. The other big factor, I think, is parents. In my experience, parents aren't great predictors of knowing what good learning looks like. Counterintuitively, especially if they've been successful in school before, because they tend to go, this is what I did 30 years ago, you should just do the same. And so I think a level of parental education is really key, because often they're the ones who have the most influence outside of lessons.
Good. Any more? We have a question there. Another one here.
In general, is there a communication channel, for example, auditory, visual, tactile, that is most effective to simulate for learning?
Oh, sorry, I didn't quite catch the question. Sorry, can you
Se no, se può tradurre. Sì, dico in italiano? Sì, allora in italiano è...
Yeah.
C'è per caso un canale di comunicazione, per esempio, tattile, visivo, che è più efficace da simulare per... Sì, legato esatto agli studi di apprendimento, quindi se è più efficace simulare, non so, un canale visivo, un canale uditivo o un altro. Quindi riferito in generale a tutte le persone.
Perfect. A really good question. Two parts to the answer. The first question is in terms of what mode works best, visual or auditory or written down. The first thing is it depends on the subject. So if I was teaching you music, it has to be auditory because that's relative to the content. If I was teaching you PE, it has to be physical, because I think it depends on the content more than one sort of style. And then the other thing, I think, evidence suggests if we combine styles, it tends to be more effective. So it's a bit of a learning myth that you're a visual person, I'm an auditory person, you might be a kinesthetic. What the evidence actually suggests is by combining, it increases students' attention, and you're more likely to actually remember it. So it depends on the content. And I think it's really important to have a combination, because we certainly had it in the UK where you'd end up with students going, I can't do it this way because I'm a visual or I'm an auditory person. And it actually, I think, limits learning. So I think looking for a range and a combination is probably our best bet. Thank you.
I think there was one question over there.
Grazie. Visto come si è presentato e poi quello che ci ha raccontato, mi ha stimolato una curiosità. C'è una base nelle teorie dell'apprendimento motorio, penso quelle cognitive, penso soprattutto a Adam Smith, e al vantaggio che può dare una pratica random rispetto a una pratica a blocchi, per quello che poi sono i risultati delle ricerche che ci ha presentato. E soprattutto volevo sapere se è vero, se risulta nelle ricerche che ha studiato, che una pratica motoria complessa, quindi con determinate caratteristiche, possa portare un beneficio ai processi cognitivi anche in altri ambiti di apprendimento.
Okay, thanks for the question. I'll do my best to try and come up with a good answer. I think when you're introducing a new skill or a new area, doing some blocking to start with is quite important because you master the fundamentals. I think the aim is to start with a blocking and then scaffold and transition into this random or this interleaving, because that way they're thinking about how do I apply that knowledge. So I think to start with, interleaving can feel like you're jumping around lots of different places, and that can be stressful for students. But I think starting with blocking and then going towards that random or that interleaving, I think can be beneficial. Now, it might depend on the task and also the level of learner. So there's some nice research that says when you're a novice, you want to build that up slowly, bit by bit. Whereas when you get to an expert, then maybe that random switching can be good. So it kind of depends, but I think it can be very beneficial if structured the right way. Hope that helps.
Any more? Any more questions? All satisfied? Okay, I think we can close it. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Beautiful presentation. Let's all keep in touch with him because I'm sure we can learn a lot and become better teachers and learners.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Hope that was okay. That was all right.